And from my perspective, the reason I analyze the petrodollar system so much is because the dollar really is kind of at the crux of global macro. So even in my investing decisions outside of Bitcoin, you're really understanding the dollar's details are a key part of getting macro right. Whether it's you're going to get inflation or deflation, commodity boom, commodity bust, emerging market boom, emerging market bust, whether or not U.S. growth is going to be fast or slow, a lot of it's based on the dollar. And so basically, because we structured things ever since the 70s around this petrodollar system, it's basically exported a lot of supply chains, especially from the United States, to these other emerging markets, led by China, but also others.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things Alex talked about, and this is just completely off topic, but I just found it fascinating, that he talked about the Second Gulf War, and he talked about at that time the Iraq government was selling their oil with the for the petro euro. I think it was the petro euro. And he said one of the interesting things is that what seems to be out of the debate for a war that we know nothing about, for why it happened, seems to be for absolutely no reasons at all, that actually might have been to defend the petrodollar, which I found fascinating.
That's one of the theories, and so for example, that got some publicity when Ron Paul spoke in Congress about it, which is kind of the highest stage that idea has had, where he was basically there's a big speech. I actually linked to it in one of my pieces, and so basically there's not a good track record of basically these countries trying to sell oil outside of the dollar-based system. And so far, actually, the most successful country that's doing it now is Russia. And it's kind of like so in the past few years, they switched to, selling oil increasingly in euros to Europe and as far as we can tell, into China. But they're obviously big enough that the United States can't do anything militarily about it. They're a major nuclear power. And so instead we have we've had these big sanction debates about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We've had these other issues, and it's kind of a chicken and the egg scenario. And so countries that are generally, for whatever reason, on the margins, for political reasons, could be extremism, whatever the case may be, when they're kind of sanctioned, they increasingly turn to selling oil outside of the dollar-based system. But also, if a country kind of sells oil outside of the dollar-based system, they tend to be these kind of relentless source of sanctions. And so it's just kind of, we basically have structured things in such a way that we have kind of an in or out kind of system. And if you're not in, then you're pushed on the margins, and you generally struggle as a country.
Do you think the petrodollar is gradually being replaced? Do you think it will collapse? Do you think countries will continue to look at other currencies to trade oil in?
There are signs that it's changing, and I went over these in my article, but essentially there's a couple key things to look at. One is that when the petrodollar system began in the 70s, the United States was something like 35% of world GDP, and we were the biggest commodity importer. And so you could argue that it makes more sense to price commodities in dollars. But now, over time, as that's kind of deteriorated, the United States is now, depending on how you measure it, somewhere in the ballpark of 20% of global GDP. And so even though we've grown, just the rest of the world's grown faster because you had the rise of China and India and some of these other countries. And so we're a smaller share of global GDP. We're still outsized, of course, compared to our population. We're like something like 5% of population, 20% of global GDP. But now we're the second biggest commodity importer. And so it's kind of funny situation where the biggest commodity importer, China, has to go through our currency in order to get commodities. And so they're interested in increasingly, using their currency to buy commodities where possible. And then you have Russia, which is also no particular friend to the United States, and they've kind of aggressively de-dollarized their reserves. They went increasingly into gold and euro-based assets instead. And then they announced, a couple years back that they were interested in selling oil in euros. And if you look at their trade over time with Europe and with China, it is de-dollarizing gradually and shifting more towards euro for both of them. And then also with China, they're also using a little bit of local currencies as well. Neither dollar nor euro, but primarily they're replacing a big chunk of the dollar portion with euros. And so over time, we're looking to see probably more diverse reserves among countries, and that there looks like there could eventually be, say, 3 currencies that can be used to buy oil rather than just one.
That feels a lot more healthy.
That is it's a more decentralized system, and it's even ironically for the United States. And so one of the biggest misconceptions is that the system benefits the United States, and it's one of those things where in the first few decades it might have, basically Cold War era type thing, strategic positioning, that sort of thing. But especially since the 90s, it's really kind of accelerated to the downside, even for the United States. And so it's one of those things where there's probably the top 10% of the people in the United States benefit from it, right? Including me, indirect. I mean, I probably benefit from it. But anyone who in the United States works in blue collar work or wants to make things, essentially, they've taken the brunt of this in the United States. And so the system's one of those. It's working for a few export heavy countries that are really kind of milking the system, and it's working for U.S. elites, and it's working for basically these kind of select groups around the world. But it's really not working well for most emerging markets, and it's not working well for most of the United States, probably at least the bottom 2/3.
Is there anything you don't know? I feel like I throw any question at you any week, and you know everything.
Well, I think you smartly ask things in fields that I know. Yeah, so inflation is one of the key things I'm tracking now because it's setting a lot of the, what types of assets are going to do well, and what the Fed response is going to be, and that of course impacts multiple aspects of markets. And so what we're seeing now is a combination of low base effects from last year. So we're comparing current numbers, CPI numbers, to a dip last year, but then also on top of that base effect, we have very hot month-over-month numbers. So things are coming in above expectations, and there's kind of two main reasons for that. One is the things I've been tracking for a while is the increase in broad money supply growth. And so ever since we saw the big money supply growth in 2020, which was different than anything that happened in 2008, 2009. So it's not just QE, it's QE that combined with fiscal spending that gets that money out into people's bank accounts. That is generally pretty correlated with price inflation. When you have the broad money supply go up, that's monetary inflation, and it tends to cause price inflation. But of course, the degree to that depends on all sorts of things related to productivity and other deflationary forces. And so once we started to open up, my base case was that big increase in broad money supply is going to be price inflationary. Now, the second thing you need is some sort of either productivity limit or scarcity. And so, for example, if you look back at the previous two inflationary decades, the 70s and the 40s, the 70s had the oil embargo, right? So you had oil shortages. And then the 40s had all sorts of commodity shortages related to, you're trying to fight the war and you want we even changed what we make our pennies out of because we needed to save the metal. And so, both those decades, basically you had the combination of big money supply growth and some sort of scarcity somewhere. And so what we're seeing in 2020 and 2021 is that we saw this big increase in broad money supply. Different countries did it at different paces. So the United States did it more than most other countries, but most countries did some kind of big M2 broad money supply increase. And then you're getting, fragilities in the global supply chain. So semiconductors are in short supply. And so that's trickling into things like used cars, right? Because it's impacting how much new cars can be made, and therefore, people are going into the used car market to increase the prices enough to convince people to sell. And so then you're seeing food price inflation, you're seeing broad commodity inflation, and so overall we're seeing pretty hot numbers come in. And I think that we saw the April numbers reported in mid-May. And next month we're going to get the May numbers reported in mid-June. I think those are going to be even higher year over year. But then after you go past that, I think the rate of change could stabilize to some extent, where it's no longer going up at the rate it has been. But a key thing I keep pointing out is the difference between transitory inflation in absolute terms and transitory inflation in rate of change terms. And so, for example, if you look at the 40s, you had these three big spikes of inflation. And so inflation would go from like 0 to like 18%, and then it would go back down to like 1%, and then it would go to 2%, and then it would go back up to like 12%, and then it would go back down. But there was never really a period of deflation after the inflation. So it's not like prices went up and then came back down. Instead, they went up, they got to a new higher plateau, and then they stabilized, and then they went up again. Then they stayed there and stabilized, and they went up again, and then they eventually stabilized for a longer period of time. And so what you have is kind of a permanent stepwise increase in prices. And so I think that's kind of, the media is kind of mixing up what transitory means. That, transitory means it's different than prices coming back down. It's prices going up and then just kind of...
That's the new price.
Yeah, that's the new price. And so, but of course you'll have some things like, there are key things that are really bottlenecked, like lumber, for example, due to the sawmill constraint. So timber is available, it's pretty cheap, but there's only so many sawmills, and so converting that timber into lumber has a bottleneck, and so you have this kind of parabolic price action. So I think some things like lumber are going to, give back some of those gains. So they already have to some extent, and so whether or not this was the peak, I don't really have a strong opinion. But basically, there are certain kind of key things that got too expensive that will come back. But in a broad sense, a lot of these price increases, even when the dust settles, will be at a higher level than where they started. And then from there, it'll largely depend on what happens next with fiscal policy. So if they don't do another big burst of fiscal, you could get inflation leveling off again. Whereas if they do another big burst of fiscal, that's when you're probably going to see another round of price increases.
Okay, so the last thing is Biden's $6 trillion figure, which is a number I can't even get my head around. What was your reaction to that?
My first reaction to all these things is questioning what parts of it are going to get through Congress. And so, for example, the president's proposal usually does not get through Congress in the original form. And as we've seen, for example, Biden's been working on this stimulus package separately, this the infrastructure bill, right? So, kind of the first proposal was like $3 trillion, and the Republicans were like, how about $500 billion? And then they're like, okay, how about $2.5 trillion? And then like, okay, how about $1 trillion? And defining what is infrastructure, right? So, kind of that debate's working its way through Congress, and it's one of those things where in the current environment, because the Senate is so closely divided, Biden can get something through with a budget reconciliation, meaning that only 50 votes are needed. But there are a handful of centrist Democrats that are kind of on the border between Democrat and Republican, and that aren't on board with the really big numbers. And so in order to get through that, he needs to kind of tone it down, and then of course the midterms come in. And so overall what we're seeing is kind of a dance between what the administration wants versus what they can get through the Senate. They can get most things through the House at this point, at least until the midterms, but getting things through the Senate is kind of their current bottleneck. And so overall what I'm weighing is less so the headlines. I kind of fade the headlines a little bit, but they're directionally important to show where the administration's headed, and then we'll see what happens with the midterms. Because if the midterms, if you get a red sweep, then it probably reduces what you're going to get. Whereas if they strengthen the blue Senate majority, then some of these bigger packages have a chance to go through. And so that's kind of what I'm watching now is more about kind of watching actual dealmanship in the Senate versus how that might affect the inflation versus deflation outlook compared to just these headline numbers.